If you eradicate transgenderism, which I believe you suggested in a post today.
No, I never suggested that.
Oh, okay. You reposted a post that was advocating for that. What would happen to the people that have already medically, socially, completely transitioned and are leading happy lives? What would happen to them? I mean, what's your plan for that? If transgenderism doesn't exist, which it seems like that's what you believe, what happens to all the people living happy lives as trans people?
Well, first of all, the whole trans it's based on a lie. You can't change your gender.
Okay, but
so they could go live their life. I mean, I can't tell someone what to do in their house.
Sounds like you do want to tell people what to do in their house.
I never said that.
So you're totally okay with people being trans, just not as long as they're in public?
No, I never said that. They could. The whole thing is based off of a lie, and I think that this lie cannot be mainstream in our society. It's a lie.
And what harm is it causing, do you believe?
I like the truth. I like truth.
Right, but I'm saying what's the harm of people expressing their gender identity differently than you believe it to be? What harm are they causing?
Like I said, we are a nation of truth, and I seek the truth.
But I'm asking about the harm. What's the harm? You might believe it to be false, but what's the harm?
The harm is that there's a lie that is very mainstream and is being embedded into every institution.
I guess I'm wondering what the material harm is. Aside from it's maybe something that you disagree with, as in your version of the truth is different than their version of the truth. What is the material harm of them living their life as a woman or man or a gender that you don't agree with?
Not anything that's wrong is there a material harm necessarily.
So there's no harm.
I didn't say that.
Hey everyone, welcome to this week's bonus show, exclusively made for our subscribers on Patreon who keep our show going. If you want to listen to the full episode, make sure that you're supporting the show at the Truth Teller level or higher. And you can sign up at patreon.com/gaslit, and you'll get bonus shows, all shows ad-free, invites to exclusive virtual events, live tapings, and so on. Thank you to everyone who supports Gaslit Nation. We could not make this show without you. And so in this episode, we're going to be answering questions from our listeners. And I want to remind everyone, because it's been just another big week of news. People feel demoralized. If you are a longtime Gaslit Nation listener, it may have meant absolutely nothing to you that the Supreme Court agreed to hear Trump's bullshit immunity case, because none of us, chronic Gaslit Nation listeners, like myself, because I do listen to the own show because I have to vet it before publishing it, none of us were surprised by any of this. Like, we're not putting any hopes into any of these Trump cases, even the promising ones in the states like New York and Georgia. The reason why is obvious. It's because they've captured the courts, they've captured the DOJ. Everything we're up against today that is driving this global crisis of fascism versus democracy, the reason why it feels like the fascists are winning, it is because the fascists in the United States of America have been playing the long game for decades, and now they are harvesting, okay? And we are playing catch up because the DNC was taking from the same corporate donors as the Republican fascists for decades. And so the Democrats, of course, had no long game strategy to counter what the far right Republicans have been doing. There were several long games in operation driven first and foremost by corporate greed. We've done plenty of interviews on this. You can look at the most recent one with the Pulitzer Prize winning journalist Jesse Eisinger of ProPublica that ran at the end of 2023. Then, of course, the historian Nancy MacLean, who wrote Democracy in Chains, and Nelson, the journalist who covered dictatorships personally as a journalist. She wrote Shadow Network. So the deep-pocketed far right, not just the Koch network, but the Powell memo saying that back in the 70s, saying that major corporations all have to have a huge deep-pocketed presence in Washington, D.C., buy up all of these politicians, left, right, and center, and create these culture wars to the bread and circus distraction of the people and make them fight each other while we reap in record profits, ushering in a new golden age for plutocrats And that's what we're seeing with a time of growing oligarchy, of the 1% being even more powerful, more rich compared to the rest of us than even the Gilded Age. It's a crisis because when you have such economic instability as this, with so many people falling through the cracks, what you have is a hotbed for rising fascism as people are looking for something to bash, to set on fire, to burn. And the culture wars become more vicious and it inflames the sadistic among us and so on. And that's why you have libs of TikTok, who you heard in this opening clip, being interviewed bravely by the journalist Taylor Lorenz of the Washington Post, and who basically confronted, because when you stare into the abyss, you realize how stupid the abyss actually is, as Taylor Lorenz shows brilliantly in her interview with Haya Rachik of Libs of TikTok, a white supremacist domestic terrorist who believes in the Great Replacement theory, as Taylor's interview shows, and targets deliberately groups right now that are being scapegoated by this global fascist movement, namely LGBTQ plus people. And wherever she targets those schools, bomb threats of other violence explode. And she's proud of that. They are proud of that. What she is using are the same type of authoritarian incitement to political violence strategies that Mussolini and his black shirts used in their rise to power, terrorism, same as Hitler and his stormtroopers, terrorism. It's just plain old-fashioned terrorism, hoping that you will shrink yourselves, that you will cower, that you will lose your voice, lose your spine, and you'll go into hiding, and they'll just come out, and their terrorism will grow more and more ambitious, more and more mainstream, but also creating full-on camps. Like, right, that's the end goal. Is they want to bring back camps where they can not only put the asylum seekers, separate families, lose children in sex trafficking operations and so on, but political opponents, right? That's the end goal. Like, Trump is very clear on that with his Project 2025. So it's larger than Trump, because Project 2025 is not just him. It's backed by the far-right Heritage Foundation. So I am running this episode so you understand that the reason why Gaslit Nation started, the reason why I said we're going to be doing this show, we're launching, was to build the big blue wave of 2018, because that was new. That was different. That had not been done before, because the establishment Dems were asleep, deliberately complicit, feeding from the same trough as their so-called Republican opponents. And that's why nothing meaningful was getting done, and our rights were slipping away, including the landmark civil rights legislation of the Voting Rights Act, and so on. And we were just up against Citizens United and deeper pockets. But 2018, which we, the Gaslit Nation community, were a part of, built and drove the blue wave. And the blue wave has set up progressive infrastructure across all 50 states that remains active to this day. The blue wave, it brought in power, brought in talent, brought in superstar organizers and independent media like ours that remain active to this day. And we are defying even the Democratic Party establishment, never mind the fascists. And just a key example, do you remember in early September 2023, we had an episode, All Eyes on Virginia, where we called to our Gaslit Nation community, said everybody needs to wake up. We know it's an off year of an election, and that's all deliberate. Off-year elections are held deliberately in an attempt to try to suppress the vote, because I think you're not going to be paying attention. So 2023 was a so-called off-year election in Virginia. And we said, no, we are paying attention, and we're going to be there, Youngkin, to make sure you lose and you embarrass yourself. And we're all going to enjoy that. And that's what we did as a community. Gaslit Nation got together with our friends at Sister District. And in late October, we made a massive amount of phone calls together. We were, at that time, the largest phone bank that Sister District had that election cycle. And also, we featured the States Project in an early September 2023 episode. The States Project raised millions of dollars to not only hold on to power in the House in Virginia, but to also flip the Senate and elect a trans woman, Danica Roem, to be the first trans senator in Virginia and in Virginia's history. And we embarrassed Youngkin. We protected reproductive health care, abortion rights in the state. And now the power that we expanded in Virginia is pushing through, to raise the minimum wage, to push for free meals for kids across the whole state, to push for greater gun safety legislation, and so on and so on. And on the list it goes. The progressive wish list is chugging away over in Virginia. And Youngkin's days as governor are literally numbered because there's an election for governor coming up. And so that was made with our power. Our collective grassroots power here at Gaslit Nation, through groups like Sister District and State Project, led to far greater fundraising dollars invested in the state of Virginia than the DNC. Okay? So what I'm telling you is this grassroots power of the 2018 blue wave is finally the long overdue answer to the long game that the fascists have been engineering against our democracy, against our economy, against the middle class, against the working class, against poor people, against asylum seekers, right? We are the answer. And I want you to remember that. So Gaslit Nation listeners, you were not demoralized this week because you knew these cases against Trump are bullshit. We've been saying that since the beginning. And one of the important reminders of this show is that grassroots power is the only power we have left. This is extremely important that we all understand this. We are following a model of self-sufficiency, a self-reliance that Ukrainians and their superstar civic society that have pushed back against not just Kremlin corruption, much like what we have here in the US, but also Ukraine's own corruption. And the reason why Ukraine is still standing as a free independent state is in large part to the superstar civic society there that practices radical self-reliance, that pushes for the recognition of gay marriage, for support of gay soldiers openly serving in the war, fighting off a genocide, while at the same time, pushing for greater transparency in its government. So Ukraine's civil society is fighting a war on two fronts: corruption and the Kremlin. And they do this through radical self-reliance, by getting their independent journalists to run for office, by creating their independent media free of oligarch censorship, by creating their own political parties, including one called Self-Reliance. So that is what we practice here at Gaslit Nation, is that model of self-reliance. And that is why this show started as a model of self-reliance. So no, it's not going to come down to useless, corrupt Merrick Garland. It's not going to come down to any of these court cases against Trump. It's going to come down, as it always has, to us. We are the answer to the fascist long game. And maybe some people feel demoralized hearing that, but I think we should all feel empowered. And if you want to know where to get in, what to support, how to be strategic, how to take action, join me at my giving circle, the State Fair Project, where you can chip in some money to help expand progressive power on the all-important state level. In Congress makes just maybe a few laws a year. In the states, around 1,000 laws are made. In the states, you have quality of life issues like public schools, free lunches, protecting LGBTQ youth from genocidal scapegoating by the far right. It's in the states where our power is. So if you're feeling demoralized, if you're angry, channel all that into joining me at State Fair, my giving circle. Give a few bucks. If 1,000 of us could put $5 as a repeat donation into the State Fair Project once a month leading into this election, we'll be pumping in $5,000 every month into expanding progressive power and the all-important state level. That is how we protect ourselves. That is how we win. That is how we sneak up on this far-right fascist threat and haunt their nightmares at night. Okay, we are the monster, not them. Big surprise, we're the monster. We're the ones who they have to be afraid of, all right? That's how we take back our power and win, and we're going to win, and I'm so excited about it. So lots is happening. The Black Hand of Death, Mitch McConnell, he's finally out, the wrecking ball of our democracy. Mitch, like any authoritarian, he clung to power for 17 years as the Republican Senate leader. Being a narcissist, he founded a institute on how to be a leader like him very early in his career before he really proved anything. He was so hell-bent on power for the sake of power that when Justice Scalia died, giving President Obama a long runway of time to appoint a new justice to the Supreme Court, Mitch McConnell used his brass knuckles to stop him, drag out that fight, claiming that it was too close to the election. And then he, of course, famously, hypocritically shoved through Amy Coney Barrett, the least qualified justice ever to be considered for confirmation, never mind being actually confirmed, just days before the 2020 election. And she was the tipping vote in taking away not just Roe v. Wade, a right to reproductive health across America, our security, which is going to inflame now further authoritarian power grabs where they're coming after IVF, but also getting rid of affirmative action and a long list of things. And obviously, McConnell has been a huge danger in protecting Trump with his 2 impeachment hearings, working with the Catholic cult known as the Federalist Society to pack 30% of our nation's courts with ideologue judges. And also in 2016, President Obama made a plea to McConnell saying, the Russians are very clearly attacking our democracy, and we need to do a bipartisan effort to stand against this and draw Americans' attention to it. And McConnell rejected this. And McConnell refused to call President Obama a president or show him any respect. And he was determined to make him a one-term president. Just Mitch McConnell was a walking, talking Confederate monument through and through. And thank God he's gone, or he's going to be gone soon. His term's up in 2027. Obviously, the person who's going to replace him is going to likely be even worse because that's just been the pattern of things. And it is looking in 2024 that the Democrats will not hold on to the Senate, but we're sure going to fight and try. We have a greater chance of hopefully flipping the House. And the big debate is which is better, to hold the House or the Senate. I would argue it's better to hold the House because, as we've seen, the Senate does tend to have more grown-ups on the Republican side, not by much. The number is getting thinner. J.D. Vance is becoming more and more normalized thanks to the fascist far-right editorial opinion sections on the New York Times. The New York Times has been laundering J.D. Vance's Russian disinformation, normalizing abandoning Ukraine. It's extremely dangerous. So right now, the House is full of extremists. The trend in the Senate is going that way too. That has not always been that way. If you consider the Senate intelligence report was very far-reaching, going even further than the Mueller report. And that was a bipartisan report led by Republicans into showing the whole corrupt architecture of how the Kremlin mafia and the Trump mafia came together to steal power in 2016 and so on. So dark days ahead, even with Mitch McConnell stepping down. But we just have to, again, fight like hell. Join me at State Fair. So I don't want, just keep your eye on the prize. There are some shining lights here. For one thing, you have the Republicans at a major financial disadvantage in this 2024 election. The Democrats are massively outraising them for fundraising numbers. You have the presumptive nominee, Donald Trump, drowning in legal debt from all of his cases. He owns something like $500 million when he doesn't even have that money personally. And Tish James, New York State's AG, is saying that she's going to take over Trump Tower if she has to pay off this debt, which would be great. They should turn it into public housing. That would be sweet justice, given how Trump and his father would discriminate famously against non-white people. So hopefully we see that. Hopefully Trump Tower becomes the People Tower. It could happen. And then we have Trump's numbers slagging in all of these primaries. Yes, he's winning. Yes, he's beating Nikki Haley, but he's also underperforming what all the polls are saying. But again, it all comes down to the slave monument at Electoral College. So we all have to fight like hell and fight locally where we live, fight through the Gaslit Nation phone banks to ensure that we protect our sovereignty from this Kremlin takeover of the United States through Trump and his MAGA fascist growing movement. And that brings us to the tragedy that recently happened in Oklahoma. I'm going to get to now to listeners' questions. Alex writes, "Hi, Andrea. I hope you are hanging in there. Thank you for being such a light in the midst of what feels like total darkness." Thank you, Alex. I have 2 questions. 1, I live in Tulsa, Oklahoma. In early February, there was a terrible hate crime at a local high school here. A non-binary 16-year-old was jumped by 3 girls in the bathroom and later died from sustained injuries. The school did not even call an ambulance. The kid was then dead named, which means they used their former name before transitioning in the press, and misgendered in their own obituary. The local media coverage has been downright shitty for the most part, using incorrect pronouns and failing to call it a hate crime. This story should be getting national coverage, but of course it's not. Here is the least harmful piece I've found so far from freedomoklahoma.org. I'm hoping you can use your platform to amplify this story and give us any advice about how to fight back against it at the local level. This is a public school we're talking about, where no practices are in place to protect LGBTQ plus kids. I am queer and have an almost 2-year-old son. My wife and I are terrified of putting him in public school, of the bullying and violence he could face for having 2 moms. We will have the important conversations, of course, but so much more is outside of our control. At least that's how it feels. Well, I just want to extend my great sympathy for everybody who is living in a so-called red hostage state, a hostage state like Oklahoma, where you are deliberately being terrorized and made to feel unsafe, including just trying to raise your children and just to live your life like any normal person. So my heart goes out to all of those folks who feel totally alone with a big target on their heads, just walking around in public with their families, and just you're being deliberately terrorized in a deliberate genocidal scapegoating campaign. It's fascism 101, what is being done to you. So obviously the reaction to that is to want to hide. But what we need now more than ever against authoritarianism is we need strong allies and we need people to be visible, unlike ever before, because that is how you push back against bullies. If you look at the example in Topeka, Kansas, with the Equality House, it is a rainbow painted house right across the street in Topeka, Kansas, from the Westboro Baptist Church, which would go around with all of these anti-hate protests, including at funerals for LGBTQ plus people. They were the original libs of TikTok. And so a group of activists in Topeka, Kansas, painted the house across from their headquarters rainbow. And that was significant in creating a beautiful tribute, a public art tribute of visibility, showing that you will not take away our joy. You will not take away our dignity. And not only that, the activists that created the Rainbow House, they found each other and they started to work to build real political power in the state of Kansas. And now Kansas has a Democratic governor. That group that did the Rainbow House elected a Native American woman to Congress and so on. And guess what? The States Project, which I mentioned earlier, which does highly strategic giving, grassroots organizing and donations targeting winnable races in mostly swing states like Pennsylvania and Michigan. For the first time, they're now in Kansas. That's huge. And all that whole shift in Kansas started from a public art project made by activists. So it goes to show, as I'm always saying on this show, it's not a feel-good thing. It's a real thing. Art is survival. Art is survival. So it's really important that your community gets together, as scared as you might feel, as overcome by grief as you may feel, and create some sort of public art tribute to Nex and not allow their murder to have been in vain, because that's going to have incredibly powerful repercussions and planting major seeds of change, which are desperately needed. And just that act of solidarity and a community coming together in defiance is going to bring forces together that are going to create a sea change over time. You have to believe that. And I did reach out to the folks at States Project to say, who is the most vulnerable in Oklahoma that a group of activists in Oklahoma could target and chip away at and try to run a race against, just to create a platform for building power, to shining a light in the faces of all that their darkness, right? Remember, the abyss is dark, but the abyss is stupid. When you stare into the abyss, an idiot stares back. That's the example, libs of TikTok. So my first thing is like, find your community, find your visibility, and shine there, and just believe in the seeds of change that that's planting. The second thing is get a good lawyer. Know your rights. I'm going to link to some sources you may already be familiar with that talk about the legal ramifications of the genocidal scapegoating of LGBTQ plus people. It's from a blog by lesbian mothers for lesbian mothers, and they talk about legal resources out there. So just make sure you familiarize yourself with your rights and the legal resources out there that are available to you, especially the emergency hotlines that you can call if you feel scared and threatened. In addition to that, I would just have a Google Doc that you and your wife share where you document everything whatever they do to try to encroach on your right to just be a normal person and live your life, document it. Just document it, because you never know when you might need it. And it'll also help you feel sane and grounded in reality, because one of the tactics they're using against you is gaslighting, where they're trying to deny your version of events, your lived experience, your right to be yourself. So just having a document open in case you should need it, in case you need to go legal on someone, in case you need to be a witness or provide a letter of support for some other case. So just have some sort of Google Doc that you both share where you just document things that happen and just kind of keep an eye on that. And again, read the legal resource I'm going to share in the show notes for this week, just to be reminded of what your rights are and the hotlines to have on speed dial should you need them. The third thing is, all of us listening to this should put pressure on Kristen Clark, the head of the DOJ's Civil Rights Division, to take over the case of Nex Benedict's murder. Because this cannot be handled locally, because it was the local officials, like the Oklahoma State school superintendent, who brought in libs of TikTok, Ryan Walters, who did this deliberately to terrorize the teachers and the librarians who are heroes to all these kids, and to try to terrorize them all into silence, into denying their very selves. So the case of Nex's murder cannot be handled locally. It must go to the DOJ as a civil rights case. And Kristen Clark at the DOJ has joined, a case in Tennessee on trans rights, but more needs to be done. And Merrick fucking Garland, waste of space that he is, Catholic cult leader for the Fellow Society, because he was active there in his tenure in his previous life. His grandpa sleepiness is just an act to hide the fact that he represents the status quo that is allowing this genocide to flourish and leaving us all vulnerable and our very democracy vulnerable. Because people have to understand, they're going after LGBTQ plus children and their families and allies today. They're going after all of us. They're normalizing state-sanctioned violence. They're normalizing authoritarian scapegoating. They're normalizing lawfare. And we cannot give them an inch. We must demand accountability. And Merrick Garland, the fact that he hasn't given a speech on Nex Benedict's murder is a mark on his disastrous time as a DOJ, like the worst DOJ in this critical moment in history. But Kristen Clark, who he appointed to run civil rights, she can be pressured. She should be called. She should be contacted. So I can create a link to that in the show notes for this week's episode. And then the fourth thing, I'm going to link to some extremely important resources that people should check out in the show notes, including a write-up by Aaron Reed on Nex's murder. Everyone should support Aaron Reed's Substack, subscribe. That is such an important breakdown that people should absorb to understand what's happening, because it's happening in Oklahoma, but what happens in Oklahoma shows you that the far right is feeding off of its own violent abuse of power, and we have to stop it. And then there's going to be another link I'm going to share on just ways to support communities in Oklahoma now, so they don't feel alone and in the dark, because they need us now more than ever. And we all have to link arms no matter where we are, whether we're in a hostage state, a so-called blue state. We're all in the same fight together. All right, so Alex goes on to write, I just read an article from Vice about a horrible sextortion ring, kids targeting other kids via social media. I won't get into the details here, as it's extremely disturbing. Have you heard about this? Is there anything you can read between the lines? Honestly, I only made it through a few paragraphs before having to take a break to sob and have a panic attack. I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on this. And mother to mother, how are we supposed to let our kids have cell phones and internet, play Minecraft and Roblox, when it can expose them to the absolute extremes of human depravity? How are we supposed to sleep at night? How can we protect our littles from all the perversity and hate right in front of them, right at their fingertips? Now, what Alex is referring to here is a brilliant, exhaustive, deep dive by Vice. Vice, which has done such fearless reporting on all of the cults out there that are actively coming for our democracy. And this is an example of one. Vice, of course, has been destroyed internally by the greed of its executives, who lived, like oligarchs while underpaying their journalists. And now there's mass layoffs there, and Vice is no more. Losing Vice is a huge loss for the work that I do, for the work that all of us do on the front lines of protecting our democracy. Vice is essential. And this investigation that they did into something I'm about to go into in a second that is deeply disturbing, deeply disturbing. Alex is absolutely right. It's sickening and it's the stuff of nightmares. Just shows you the tenacity of their investigative journalists there and what a public service they were providing for us. So I will link to a summary of this Vice investigation in the show notes. So you don't have to read the article, which is extremely disturbing, but you can get a summary of it that Vice itself provides because they know how dark this story is. And it's a story of kids using Discord and Telegram to clout chase, to try to win popularity contests where they groom other children and blackmail and intimidate other children into carrying out vicious, horrific acts of violence against their own pets, against their own younger siblings, and against themselves, including sexual violence. And many of the victims that were roped into this go on to become perpetrators to try to escape the role of victim because they don't know what else to do. The FBI has gotten involved and arrested 2 of the organizers who are children. And it's believed that there are many more children that have been arrested, but we don't know about it because they're children. The victims tend to have been targeted from online groups that were already considered vulnerable. So LGBTQ plus groups where children were sharing information about anorexia. So groups of children that were already looking for community, struggling with their own issues and so on, and looking and reaching out. Those were the ones that were targeted and groomed. And the acts of evil that they were pressured to carry out became snuff films, child pornography that spread around the world. And this movement online was also, surprise, surprise, being driven by Nazi groups, terrorist groups. And the darker purpose behind all of this is, of course, to normalize sadism, to normalize violence, to normalize destruction, to basically desensitize people towards this. Because once you're doing these acts, it becomes easier to carry them out. And then as you get older and you make your way through the world, whatever power you inhabit in the world, as in a corporation or in government, you have your sadist badge. You know what you've done and you've no problem carrying it out. What's behind it is a larger cultish, terrorist, accelerationist movement to groom sadists, groom terrorists who are going to help build and carry out a violent authoritarian regime, because that's how authoritarians stay in power, is through violence, through terror. And that's what's really behind this and driving it. And the way it became this doom loop of these kids getting pulled into this is because the reality is that children's brains, as we all know, are still developing until their mid-20s. And when they're in the preteen, teenage years, the parts of their brain that become overactive are all about social acceptance, wanting to be accepted. So they're feeding into this because it's the neuroscience is feeding into this, which is why social media companies are so devastating in deliberately engineering these algorithms to hook into this, which is why you saw, especially young girls, being driven to die by suicide and self-harm because of deliberately and dangerously engineered algorithms on Instagram meant to boost Instagram's profits through engagement, never mind that it was causing self-harm. So yes, the social media companies are not going to save us here and help us here. Why? Because as the saying goes in Ukraine, as the oligarchs see the people, we're the shit they grow their money in. They don't care about us. They don't care about our children. So what can we do? Again, the theme of this episode and every single Gaslit Nation episode is self-reliance. Self-reliance. Every single one of us has to embrace and practice radical self-reliance. And for parents, that means just being hyper vigilant of what your kids are consuming online, regularly having conversations with them with what they are consuming online, putting limits on it, putting whatever controls you can on it, ensuring that you're monitoring it, because just because your kid is sitting right next to you on the couch or in the other room online doesn't mean they're not in a room full of strangers doing God knows what. So for raising children in the 21st century with rising authoritarianism around the world, we have to be hyper vigilant and more engaged in our kids' lives than ever. The era of the latchkey kid, where you can just run around and be left to your own devices, running around the neighborhood on your bike because there was no internet. What else are you going to do? That's over. That's over. So Alex, just like you're in the stage as I am in, I have a 2-year-old too. We have to be hyper vigilant with our 2-year-old, because if you turn around for 1 second, next thing you know, they have a permanent marker. They're drawing with a Sharpie all over the couch. right? All over the walls. That's how we have to be with our kids for the rest of their lives until their brain fully develops. We just have to be in their lives. We have to make sure they have healthy mentors, healthy activities in their lives. So their lives are full of good people, a good safety net that's going to catch them and guide them and use their superpowers for good in the world and not feel small and unworthy and driven to self-harm as these social media rabbit holes can really pull them into doing. And it's the fault of the social media companies. And it's also just the neuroscience is working against them and they can't help it. Just like the toddlers can't help the tantrums, that age group really needs a lot of help and hand-holding and guidance. And I will link to a resource for parents on how to talk to your kids about social media and what you need to be aware of. All right, so let's get to some more questions from our listeners.